Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for a very controversial topic today. So we have with us Ms. Léna Salamé. She's a lawyer from Sorbonne University, specialized in conflict management and mediation, which she acquired from the Harvard-MIT Tufts Joint Program. She served in the United Nations system for 17 years as strategic coordinator of its main program on water conflicts and cooperation. She played a central role in the development and promotion of the modern concept of hydrodiplomacy. She conceived around 100 capacity building activities on international law, conflict management, and cooperation processes. She trained over 1,500 persons on related topics. She also lectured in over 200 international events around the world. Her audiences encompass young, mid, and high-level professionals, executive officers, as well as media professionals, decision makers, and civil society. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Léna Salamé.
Thanks, Sibel. So, hi everyone. Who is in the room? Who is a student in the Faculty of Agriculture? Who is a student of Political Sciences? No one. Who are the others? Huh? Agriculture. Huh? Sorry. Yes, Mike, I didn't recognize you. You changed. Eh, sorry. Okay, راح شيلها هيدي. Hop. Okay, sorry, Mike. Okay. So, هيدا كتير عالي. لك بلي أحسن. لا بدكم تسجلوا. ما بيطلع صوت. طب من ده. اوكي. لكن اكثريتكم اجريكلتشر؟ يلي مش اجريكلتشر شو عاملين؟ كلهم بقوي؟ اوكي. ده. في احكي اشياء بلا تعمل. بلا ايمان. Iman is going to be the censor of what I'm going to say. Like, you have seen, have you ever read this? You did? So how does it sound to you? Obsolete, absolutely. But why did they say that? But they said that it is obsolete. But the idea that wars will be fought over water is still going on. People still say, especially in the Middle East, that wars will be fought over water, right? Especially the idea came from here. So why did they say that? Are we really facing a water crisis? And what is a water war? And is cooperation rational? This is what we're going to see today, okay? So first of all, we're going to make a small investigation. What is the status of the water resources globally, okay? So first of all, do you know this, the James Bond effect of water resources? Do you know that on the globe, 80% of the water resources is salty water, marine water, okay? From the 20%, remaining 20%, 80% are held in the glaciers and in the permafrost, right? And from the remaining 20%, 80% is held in the ground. It's aquifer, groundwater resources. What is left is almost 0.07%. Okay? We say it's a blue planet, but actually only 0.07% of the global water resources of the Earth are easily accessible and fresh to our human uses. Okay? So you don't forget it's 0.07%. This is one fact. لا كتير عالي. Second fact, water is unequally distributed in space. Okay? So you see that, for example, 60% of the world population in Asia has access to 36% of the water resources of the world. While, for example, in Latin America, the tendency is exactly the opposite. 26% of the freshwater resources of the world are available for only 6% of the world population. And this is even more true in the Middle East, where you have almost 36 million people, and you have a very small rainfall rate, okay, which is sometimes lower than 100 millimeters cubic millimeters per year in the Sinai, for example. Okay, so you have a lot of people with little water. A third fact is is the fact that water is not equally distributed in time. Okay, so sometimes you have a lot of water and sometimes you don't have a lot of water, and this tendency of more droughts and more floods is becoming even more true, and it's going to increase in the future, apparently. We don't know, is it the BBC effect or the CNN effect because we know more about these events, or is it because the hydrological cycle is becoming quicker? We have more floods, more drought, and it's going a little bit quicker. So actually what is sure is that stationarity is gone, okay? And we definitely have the climate change as a wild card in the future. We don't know really what's going to happen. We do have forecasts, but we definitely know that dry areas are going to be drier, and humid areas are going to become more humid. There will be more floods, even if some people still are skeptical about global warming and climate change. Okay, so this was on the top of all the problems or all the facts that I stated. We have the wild card of the climate change.
This is a White House.
Sorry?
This is taken from the White House.
This one? Yes. It's the back wall of the White House. It's Trump. Actually, the signature is not there, but it's signed by Trump. So, in addition to that, another fact: 45 years ago, we had, for example, an average of 12,500 cubic meter per person and per year of fresh water globally. Today, we have an average of 5.5 to 6,000 cubic meter per person and per year. So what happened? While we know that the same amount of water resources is in the earth since the dinosaurs walked the earth, because we have the hydrological cycle, right? So the same amount of water is changing status on the earth since the day the dinosaurs walked the earth. But why did the average amount of water drop from 45 years ago until now from 12,000 cubic meter per person and per year to 5,000 cubic meter per person and per year? Exactly, population growth. Population growth, absolutely, and all kinds of different needs. Since the Industrial Revolution, our needs have increased exponentially. We use more water for all our activities, right? Look at this. You use water for your showers, for your apples, for your cotton, your jeans, your tea, your coffee, your golf courses, your cars, your phones, for everything. And there are more and more people and the same amount of water. So, of course, there is less per capita water, okay, today in average, okay? So, and indeed, you saw all the activities. All these activities are necessary for need water for their development. So, indeed, water is the only thread that goes through all the SDGs, all the Sustainable Development Goals. You need water for education. You need water for health. You need water for food. You need water to alleviate poverty. You need water for gender equality. You need water for business. You need water for industrial and agricultural activities, right? So you need water for everything. Look at this graph, for example, from Zimbabwe. It shows the level of rainfall in Zimbabwe and their GDP. There is a correlation between the GDP of Zimbabwe, so their level of development, and the level of water availability, right? Are you following me so far? Okay. So that's another fact. So the sixth fact is that water is very closely linked to development. And it is the only thread that goes through all the SDGs. And then to make things even more complicated, in order to organize the international society, we have created borders that have nothing to do with the borders of a basin, a natural basin. You recognize the basin. It's the river with all its tributaries, the source, and the deltas on the other side. So we have created international borders that do not respect the flow of the water, and the water goes through, and then this creates all of a sudden what we call transboundary basins. Okay? So some people say internationally shared basins, some people say international basins, some people they say shared basins. All these are synonyms as long as you explain clearly what you mean behind it. Some people, for example, the Turkish don't like to use the word shared, because when you say shared, it means that you have already decided that you're going to share the Tigris-Euphrates, and they are not eager to share it. So the word shared is not acceptable for them. The word internationally shared basin is also not acceptable for some populations, because it means that the basin is international, like international high sea waters that is accessible to anyone. So Canada can come to the Jordan and say, oh, it's international water, so I can take water from it. But the UN Convention on this topic uses the word internationally shared water courses, okay? So just to let you know that there are different terms that want to say the same thing, so you don't get confused, A, and B, when you want to use one of these terms, you have to be sure that your audience knows what you're talking about. So for the sake of clarity, I'm going to use transboundary basins in the rest of the lecture. Okay? So we have actually 310 transboundary basins in the world. This is the map of the world redrawn with the limits of the transboundary basins, and not the limits, not the borders of the political borders of the countries. We actually have 310 transboundary basins. This concerns 150 countries, and this concerns more than 40% of the world population. So more than 40% of the world population live in basins where their water depends from water from outside of the basin. So Lebanon, for example, is in this case for some part of it, in the north and in the south. So we use water that is linking us to our neighbors, okay? We have in the Middle East 4 transboundary basins. Syria is the country that shares all of them with its neighbors. And Jordan is the basin that is shared by most countries: Jordan, Lebanon, Palestine, Syria, and Israel, okay? This is the situation of surface water resources. Now we have something even more complicated. It's the groundwater resources. So the groundwater resources are hidden, so we don't see them, and we actually have difficulties to delineate them and to know in which direction the flow goes, right? So on the surface water, the water goes from upstream to downstream. Under the ground, it can go in different directions. So the relationship upstream, downstream doesn't exist, should not be understood in the same manner. We have counted so far 600 transboundary aquifers, and we haven't finished counting them. In the Middle East, we have 10 aquifer systems, so 10 groundwater resources systems that are shared by 2 to 4 countries, and the amount of water that is under the ground in the Middle East exceeds by far the flow of water on the surface. This is one thing. The second thing is that the region groundwater is largely non-renewable. So if you use water from these aquifers, then you are depleting the aquifer. If you use it in a non-sustainable manner, it's not going to recharge. And actually, in some cases, some shared aquifers are so overused that they are being emptied or they're becoming polluted before we even delineate them. So before we even know how big they are, what is their situation, what is the data related to them, we are already emptying them. This is the situation in the Middle East. Oops. So does it mean that we're going to have water wars? So what is a water war? Huh? What? Go ahead, shoot. What? What is a water war? Yeah. Yeah. One, yes. Ah, be careful. Litani is a national river. It doesn't cross a border. The Litani source is in Lebanon, and then the delta is in Lebanon. It throws itself in the Mediterranean before the border of Israel. So it's a national river. It is not a transboundary river. But maybe Israel wants to have control over the Litani. Then this is something else, but this is very interesting because this would mean that Israel wants to have control over water and then wants to fight Lebanon for this. So this brings me to before, this is like a parenthesis, but the guy in khaki wanted to say something. You wanted to say something? About the definition of water war. You're on the spot. No? Okay, so water war would be what the media has been saying when the whole idea of water wars and water cooperation came up, and we started developing the concept of the modern concept of hydrodiplomacy and how to fight the water war idea. The media meant by water war, and what was meant in the first three statements of Kofi Annan, Ismail Seragandin, and Boutros Boutros-Ghali, was that two sovereign countries, would go to war against each other, and the objective of the war would be the control of water resources. Okay? So that's for clarity's sake. Now, we have to be careful and distinguish this situation with the situation of intrastate conflicts. Intrastate conflicts are situations where people inside one country will have a conflict against each other because of water. And this is one case in Kenya between two tribes, the Kiyuku and the Maasai, okay, where people were killed, policemen were displaced, and people were displaced and policemen were mobilized to stop the conflict. But it is not two states, it is two tribes within one state. There is also the situation where water is a victim or a weapon in a conflict, like the situation where Saddam Hussein poisoned the water resources to harm his opponents who were Shiite in Iraq. Okay, so here it's not a water war. His objective was not to control the water, but to use the water as a tool in order to quell the opposition. Then we have situations where water is a tool in the negotiation. For example, Turkey has used the water resources in order to put pressure on Syria and to ask them to stop the flow of refugees that is coming to Turkey. Then we have also a situation where water is one element of a broader conflict, like between Israel and Lebanon. So you have the problem of refugees, you have the problem of the borders, you have the problem of the water, you have the problem of and so on and so forth, territory and so on. So water is one element of the broader conflict, and it can be the element that ignites the conflict or the skirmish, but it doesn't mean that it is a water war, because anyways, two sovereign states won't go to war against each other because of one reason. Usually there is a whole set of factors that will bring two countries to war. Even the Second World War didn't start because of one event. It started because of so many different events happening all around the globe. Okay, and it was ignited after the assassination of the Archduke in whatever. Okay, so if we look at the different interactions, positive and negative interactions between two or more countries related to water resources, then we see over a time span of 60 years, we see that actually there are almost 2,000 interactions related to water between two countries. And if we put them on a scale from -7 to +7, -7 being a formal war and +7 being a reunification between two countries because of water, we will notice that there is no -7 and no +7. There are more positive interactions than negative interactions. It doesn't mean that there is no negative interactions. There are negative interactions. There are conflicts related to water. But conflicts doesn't necessarily mean war. There are different stages of conflicts before you get to war. There is political tension, there is economic tension, there are little skirmishes, and so on and so forth. And if you look at the -3, these are the negative interactions that mostly happened between Israel and its Arab neighbors. Okay? And if you look at what these interactions are about, you will notice that there are so many different issues around which countries will cooperate, like, for example, quantity, hydropower, navigation, flood control, economic development, joint management, and so on, irrigation. And mostly, conflicts happen around infrastructure and quantity. Who's going to get what? And you built a dam and you didn't notify me and you're cutting the water from me. Okay? So there are more reasons to cooperate than reasons to have a conflict. It doesn't mean that there is no conflict, but apparently there is no war. Now, the one conclusion of that study about the interactions on positive and negative interactions is that the likelihood of conflict rises in a basin when the rate of change exceeds the resilience, the capacity to absorb that change in the basin. So, for example, if, like on the Tigris-Euphrates, you have the building of a dam, and you don't have an institution to absorb this change, like, for example, a treaty of cooperation between the countries or a river basin organization that's going to deal and to manage with this change, then there is a high likelihood of conflict. So that is what we call uncoordinated development in a basin. Then you have internationalized basins, like in the Aral Sea. In the Aral Sea was a national basin during the Soviet Union. And then overnight, when the Soviet Union collapsed, the Aral Basin was shared, became a transboundary basin shared by 5 countries: Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan. So all of a sudden, there is no institution to absorb this change. There is no treaty. There is no river basin organization. Then there is a higher likelihood of conflict and the possibility of conflict. Then there is general animosity. When countries have bad relationships, they could also have bad relationships related to water, but we will see later that it is not necessarily always the case. Okay? Now, this picture to show you that while two countries will not go to war against each other, as we go down the geographical scales, the conflicts become more acute. So 2 countries will not go to war against each other, but 2 farmers may kill each other because of the use of one single well, for example. Okay? So the likelihood is of conflicts and the seriousness of the conflict can be higher as we go down the scale. This is a study that shows the hotspots that for the coming 15 to 30 years. And you see that the Middle East is identified as one of the hotspots. And the indicators for this study were based on environmental water stress, human water stress, nutrient pollution, exacerbating factors to hydropolitical tensions, and changes in population density. So you see that in the Middle East, Central Asia, in the Ganges-Brahmaputra more specifically, and in Southern Africa, there is a risk for higher rate of conflicts related to transboundary water issues. But this is only a projection, okay? This doesn't mean that it's going to happen and that war will go. So this is the question, actually. Since we have the situation that we have, okay, it's a little bit of a water crisis with population growth, with water that is not distributed equally in time or in space, with more pressure, more competition, and so on and so forth. And it's very important for development. So if you want to develop, you're going to want to have water. You think of the Grand Renaissance Dam that Ethiopia has built, right? Ethiopia has the right to develop, so they have the right to be able to use water for their development. But then they have built a dam in an uncoordinated manner, which means that the downstream countries are opposing to this infrastructure, and it has created a conflict. And why would it be rational for Ethiopia to cooperate with the downstream countries, for example? عشان ما يصير في war. بس بقول لك أنا بعيد. Ethiopia is far from Egypt. What are they really going to do? There will be no war. Let's see why. Thank you. I love what you said. Okay. So this is the case of, look at the case of Central Asia. Okay. You have the Aral Sea with all the countries that I listed before. The water is produced upstream. Okay. So the source of water is upstream. It is at the level of Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. Okay. And then, but then it flows downstream towards Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan. And actually, most use of the water is done downstream, okay? So the upstream countries are saying, wait, we want to use the water in winter because we want to produce hydropower, because we want to heat our houses, we want to use electricity in the winter, and so on and so forth. And then, so we want to use the water in winter, hydropower, and then we're going to let the water flow in winter. But then the downstream countries say, oh no, but we don't want the water in winter. Don't flood us in winter. We want the water in the spring and in the summer when we have to irrigate our cotton fields and all our agricultural fields. So they have a conflict of interests, okay? So there is a conflict. There is no war, but there is a conflict. It's not an international armed conflict. It's just a conflict of interest, conflict of objectives, divergence of views. Okay, so so you have this this discrepancy in time between their interests, okay, from one side and the other. And this is a typical situation in an upstream downstream country. Indeed, when you have that basin. So this is upstream, this is downstream, the transboundary, the border, you have the transboundary basin, and then this creates a water asymmetry, okay? So there is an unbalance in the relationship. And then usually the water flows downstream, except in groundwater cases, and we tend to always look upstream and see what is happening upstream. And we fail to look at what is happening downstream and what are their interests, and why does Egypt, for example, want water? Why do the countries of the Aral Sea on the downstream side want the water? And do we ignore it? Do we not ignore it? So actually, normally, the normal reaction is that I want the water now. I want my water now. I want everything now. Turkey, China, Ethiopia, the countries of the Aral Sea, and you name it, okay? So in often situations, I want everything now. So why would water users voluntarily accept to forego benefits? Why? Because first of all, because of the vital characteristics of water. Because water is so important for development, we saw, and then the development cannot happen without a long-term, secure management of water resources. And because of the principles of ethics and so is hydro-solidarity, because of the principles of the UN Convention, all this is very nice, and many countries ignore them. But in theory, we will get to the practice later, in theory, All these principles should imply that water users have to respect the needs of others, and it implies also that they should forego immediate benefits for longer term benefits, and then these principles should shape their negotiations. This is in theory, okay? So, actually, if we move towards practice, we will see that if the users acknowledge their interdependence, yeah, if they acknowledge that they depend on each other, not only for water, but for other things, and not only in the present, but also in the future, and if they increase these interdependencies, then they might recognize the need for cooperation. So if you are living in a building, for example, and you're upset with your neighbor, you just pack your things and may move to another apartment. But if you are in the same basin, you're not going to pack your stuff and move with your whole population to Alaska. You are stuck in the basin together. So you have to do something about it. And actually, the strategy to do that is to make explicit existing interdependencies and to even seek further interdependencies. Interdependencies may sound like limiting, but actually the benefits of interdependencies are higher for both parties. So, and this can happen by data sharing, by joint infrastructure development, benefit sharing, issue linking. So, like what Turkey did with Syria, they linked the issue of refugees with the issue of water. Things that have nothing to do with water can be linked to each other in order to enlarge the pie and create more interdependencies. The practical case that I can present today, but there are other cases, it doesn't mean that it works in the whole world and in every basin, but we have the case of the Indus Water Treaty signed in the 60s by India and Pakistan, two otherwise very hostile countries. They signed an agreement, and their agreement lasted through 2 Indo-Pakistani wars. And then it was done with the help of the World Bank. So actually the war, the concept of war, the idea of having a war over water does not lead to a long-term national secure water management scheme, while the cooperation would do that, and countries, even if they are hostile, will technically cooperate over water despite the political rhetoric. So even if there is a political rhetoric saying that we are in conflict, and we're not going to cooperate, they will actually technically cooperate in general and in most cases. There are cases where you don't have a relationship with the other country, like in the case of Lebanon in Israel. So this is an outcast. It doesn't come into this scheme. So a few facts, interesting states on the regional cooperation. You have to know that in the region there are only 8 agreements on water. Most of them are focused on quality of water. A lot of the cooperation goes towards water supply, so really responding to the needs and not managing the needs. Sometimes they include groundwater resources, but there is no agreement only on groundwater resources, despite the fact that we saw how much groundwater is important in the region. And the riparian countries are always trying to divide the water resources rather than trying to share the benefits that derive from water. So I have so much water, and instead of dividing the water in 2 parts, I can think of dividing the water and the benefits that derive from it, like hydropower, like agricultural products, and so on, like industrial products and so on. Now we have, to help countries do that, we have the international law. We have 3 main tools in the international law: the United Nations Convention on the Non-Navigational Uses of Water Courses, that was signed in 1997 and only entered into force in 2014. But one has to bear in mind that even if it was not in force, its principles applied in practice, because it is only a codification exercise. The convention only wrote down principles of law and customary law that existed and applied to inter-state relationships anyway, because in international law, the sources of law are not only the text. It's the text, the general principles of law, the customary law, the jurisprudence, and the doctrines. So the general principles of law and customary laws that provide for equitable and reasonable use of water resources in a transboundary basin and non-significant harm, they existed before the convention was written. So even though it took so much time to have the convention enter into force, its principle could apply. The UNECE Convention on the Protection and Use of Transboundary Water Courses and International Lakes, sorry, there's a typo. This convention was only for the European Union region, but in 2014 also, it opened up and became global. So Lebanon can access this convention as well. And the convention also has the same principles of equitable and reasonable use and then non-significant harm and so on. And then you have a set of draft articles on the law of transboundary aquifers, but these are only a set of law recommended for the use of countries if they want to establish an agreement or if they want to cooperate on groundwater resources. It is not a legal text, it is soft law, okay? The easiest actually, before the law gives you the directions, and then in practice, sorry for the typos as well, in practice, the easiest way to achieve cooperation and the less expensive way and the quickest way to achieve cooperation over water resources is to go through alternative dispute resolution techniques. Because if you, I don't know if you have heard of the case of the Gabčíkovo-Nagymaros case between Czechoslovakia and Hungary, it took 10 years for the International Court of Justice to look at the case that opposed Hungary to Czechoslovakia on a part of the Danube. And then after 10 years, it told the two countries, go back and negotiate in good faith. Same thing for the pulp mill case. Pulp mill case between Uruguay and Argentina. It took 5 years, and then the court told the two countries, go back and negotiate in good faith. So it is easier, quicker, less expensive, and it preserves the relationship to go towards negotiation, facilitation, mediation, rather than to litigation. Because as you go this way, you lose control over the process, and you strain the relationship. On this side, you remain consensual, and then you keep control over the process. And actually, if you are there, it means that you are listening to the other party, and scientists have actually discovered that listening to the other people's viewpoint causes no real harm. Okay, so this is in general, whether it's for water and states or for you personally. Okay, and then this is not interesting. So, and this is my conclusion. So normally we should be able to achieve cooperation over water. It is not definitely a source of conflict. Okay? So if you have questions now, you can ask questions. And if everything was clear, it's okay, you can go. No, it doesn't go. Okay. So does anyone have question? Or I was so... Yes, please, no problem. Bye-bye, thank you. Thank you, thank you. No questions. Iman, not even you? You're speechless? خليهم يحكوا قبل. Okay. لا. ما عم بيسترجوا. إيه؟ The water problem, it's a national problem of water provision. They reach reach day zero بيسموه day zero انه وصلوا ما بقى في مي سكروا الحنفيات ما بقى في مي. قريت كتير عنه بس ده خلينا نتذكر بس. They actually there was لأنه you know that outsiders like inhabitants of basins outside of Cape Town, it was in Cape Town the problem, they forewent actually their immediate farmers' benefits. The farmers around the city actually, for example, they decided to forego some of their immediate benefits in farming and then they let water flow that normally doesn't flow to Cape Town in order to let people have their minimum water supply for human use. They helped each other. So human use is the basic, is the most important. And then you have the other uses like the agricultural use, the industrial use, and so on. And then what happened is that within the country, they helped each other and then they let the water flow. This was one of the options. And then the other one is that they had reservoirs, they emptied them, but then they are planning to refill them as they go on. But this was really an emergency situation. And then in South Africa, in the constitution of South Africa, access to water is a basic human right. So they had it in their constitution before even the UN declared it as a human right. So really, this is in the spirit of the country, in the culture of the country. They help each other, and then that's what another. And then the third thing is that they also they make people pay above a certain use of water. So like you have a minimum use, and then if you go beyond that minimum use, you start paying a tariff. And then as you go for bigger uses, then you pay even more. And if you want to wash your car every day, you'll pay more. And if you want to fill in your swimming pool, you'll pay exponentially more. And this helped also in managing. So this is a good example as compared to here in Lebanon, for example, or in the Middle East in general, is that they manage the demand instead of trying to respond to it. يعني مش قد ما الواحد بده منعتيه، لازم يهتموا، لازم ينتبهوا العالم يسكروا الحنفيه وقت يغسلوا اسنانهم، ينتبهوا وقت الحنفيه عم بتروح مي. يعني it is a demand management way of doing instead of supply responding to demand.
Yes, thank you for this presentation. I've worked on water rights adjudication for about 5 years in the United States. So I was involved in a lot of court cases of water users suing each other. And I know what you mentioned is very accurate, like it will eventually lead to a settlement rather than to a conflict. When you speak about international water law, don't you think that given what's happening in Ethiopia now, given what's happening in Turkey, also building dams on the tigers, do you think that the UN is just watching and doing its job?
Well, actually, the UN doesn't have the mandate to intervene. If it's called upon to mediate or to provide good offices or to help in data collection or setting up a joint management scheme or helping to set up a river basin organization, it can do that. But the UN doesn't have the mandate to interfere unless international security is at stake. So for the time being, and then when the international security is at stake, then the Security Council has to make the decision, and then blue helmets will be sent on in the field. So for the time being, it was not considered a threat to international security because cooperation is still going on. You have to bear in mind that if we said that conflict is not war, and there are different stages of conflict, you also have to bear in mind that conflict and cooperation are not exclusive of each other. You can have a conflict and at the same time cooperation is going on. So, and then at different rates. So as cooperation goes higher, the rate of conflict goes lower and vice versa. So in the Nile Basin, there is the Nile Basin Initiative. Of course, Egypt has withdrawn somehow, but there are still ways that they are still they are still trying to communicate. It's not they are not at the stage of war and at the stage of threatening international security. So the UN doesn't have the mandate to interfere, and the UN is only at the service of the countries. So the big guy, Gutierrez, is the Secretary General of the United Nations. He's not a superpower. He cannot decide on his own.
Exactly. So mentioning power, that means the country who's in power can do whatever it wants, what is the point of the rule?
This is what happens normally.
How can we move forward and make these water conventions?
Listen, it could happen. It could happen.
You have all of these water conventions and how we can come up with Transboundary conventions and but they are not respected by countries. What message are we sending to the people?
It is a very good question and very frustrating. I'm the first one who feels that way. But if you say, okay, we are in the situation. The situation is this way, in the Nile, okay? So why did Egypt not bomb the GERD yet? Why did it not bomb it?
Because they can't. They're afraid. They think
قولي لي ليه؟ From outside.
There's also on this point before.
طيب شو بنعمل يعني if you have a war?
It's a hydropower plant and it's downstream of Ethiopia. They're not going to use the water. They're just going to store it and then release it. So even hydrologically, the effect. I haven't seen any study showing the impact.
There are many studies. The biggest impact is going to happen when they're going to fill the dam.
They already started.
After they finish.
They started there. It's exactly.
But the وقت كتير بس هو this is the period where the biggest impact is going to happen when they're filling the dam. And I don't even agree with the fact that Ethiopia doesn't see the interest of cooperating with Egypt and more cooperation with Sudan as well.
The government was putting a 4-inch well on the West End and they threatened with a bombing from the airplanes. But Egypt didn't do anything when giving it.
But then, Israel even didn't bomb it because it also had pressure from outside. Because at the same time, the Iraq war was starting, and then the US didn't have time to and interest to put into this story. So there is always something that is going. There is international pressure, and then even if they bomb them, it doesn't mean that it's a war because of water. Lebanon and Israel have bigger problems than only the water. Water is part, and it's a very important part of the problem, but it's not the only problem. You see, between the US and Canada, there are tens of dams, for hundreds of years. There is a lot of water as well, but scarcity, the indicators show that there is more cooperation in areas of scarcity than in areas of
If you look
water.
at Mexico and the United States and the Colorado River, not a single drop passes the U.S. border to Mexico.
I agree with you. The response is not general. If it was general, I would have won the Nobel Prize. Did you see that? We don't have the response, but we have a tendency, and we have there is a way of thinking that is more constructive than another way of thinking. In some places it happens, in some places it doesn't happen, and of course there are sometimes the hydro-hegemon, that was Egypt at the beginning. Egypt was the hydro-hegemon until the project of the GERD started by Ethiopia and they started building it. So it was totally reversed. So you can be downstream and be a hydro-hegemon. And like in Israel as well. So what is
asked the Egyptians, does Ethiopia have water? They say it is the Chateau d'eau of Africa.
Ethiopia.
Ethiopia, she has a lot of water.
Mm.
So, and we know who is behind the
Mm.
Is Zionism is there. It's not the secret. So the way it was done as a hydrohegemony, as we said, you know. And we say for water, first we drink as human beings. Second, we eat, we live. And third, we make fish. So Ethiopia is making all of this for hydropower, you know, to send the electricity. And it is wrong for the human being priority. Now it is done like this because Zionism is there. It is obvious. We know it and it is proved and everything. So what? And Egypt began to threaten the war. And then there was one minister there that said, okay, you want to do it? All the people that will die from the Delta, and then there will be no more water, I will bring them to the border of Ethiopia. Now the pressure came, and the minister is no more a minister. The second day it was out. So we cannot say why Egypt is not doing anything, because let her eat Egypt first. Yeah, they play with the grape. The wheat. They eat the wheat, so they shut up. But till now, there's nothing. As you said, film will make more.
The impact. Yeah, it is very frustrating, and the worst of everything is that there are so many different studies that show how cooperation undergird can happen and the benefits with the downstream countries. But the situation is such, and the UN cannot do anything, that's for sure.
Not only this, in our region, it is special. Then we spoke of India, which is also hydroelectric, Sri Lanka, and Pakistan. Our here, because we have the it's a case. We cannot do anything. You know, even United Nations, even if they have mandate, we cannot do anything. But till now, we are for Lebanon at least, whoever speaks in Lebanon about any cooperation, we are resistant. Now, we did cooperation with Orontos, with Syria, because we are brothers in the end, even though we have some sounds there, and Al-Kabir and all this, right? But we can speak, we can do. With Zionism, we cannot. So we can see how we are going to deal. Because Israel is in remote control for Hasbani. They invaded us for 25 years, and Hasbani was they withdraw, but still with remote control.
I totally agree. Lebanon is in a situation but Lebanon does not even recognize Israel. So how is it going to deal with it? So there is a bigger problem. Yeah, there is a bigger. The young lady and the
Just one thing about what she was saying is that there were some tripartite meetings between Israel, Lebanon, and the UN. It's happening in South, and it happened between 2010 and 2013 for the agreement about the forage,
drilling.
Exactly, the resources that they found, the petroleum, the gas that they found actually. So it reached nowhere. That's the problem. But it happened. It's happening, and the UN is doing that through mediation, and they are doing tripartite meetings with them. So
For petrol.
it could happen for water.
So this
but they're doing that.
Listen, you said it is not only water. For me, for us, the people that think like me, Israel cannot live without water, right? And Israel, Zionism, will make anything, any war for water. So don't convince us that there are so many things and water. It is not true. We are living here, we are seeing what is happening. You speak again. I like it very much, but now I'm speaking business. You speak UNESCO and everything. This big institution and cooperation, we know, we want to finish. We people of Lebanon, we want to finish. But if we don't get our rights as we should be, we are still in war.
I'm not contradicting you.
بس إنه لا.
But هيدا كله اللي
It is
أنتم
not only water, it is water. يعني the people that said the water, war for water, and it's not like war. I don't like war, but it is.
Okay.
It is.
And Mike wanted to say something.
I want to say about the Jordan, like one of the best examples of water cooperation between enemies is Jordan and Israel.
We are no more enemies.
No, before they made the treaty, I think.
أنت عارف
They made the treaty before they made a peace agreement, and now Jordan and Israel. I studied also in Jordan. They have shared water resources 50%, 50%, and they are still, as people, they don't like. Even not only Zionists, they don't like Jewish. It's more religious. So I think it can work out between enemies in transboundary countries with a third party like the World Bank, like Germany, like even Lebanon and Israel. They cooperated with Hezbollah for the missing martyrs or soldiers with the help of Germany. So usually when you want a solution, you can reach a solution even with your enemy. This is what I want to say.
There is no general recipe. There is no general truth. There is no general recipe. What is true in one place is not true in the other. Every basin is specific. Every peoples are specific. So you cannot really generalize. But there are examples, and the tendency is to try and follow the more constructive examples than the ones that